Thanks very much, Bob, and thanks to all of you for coming and letting me talk about flying for the Navy during the Cold War. I was in the Navy from 1955 to 1959. If you do the quick calculations, that was 68 years ago. A few things have changed, but probably most of what I tell you, first of all, most of what I will tell you is true.
Good place to start.
Okay, it was just after the Korean War, which finished in 1953, run about 3 years, and the draft was still in operation. Actually, it had stopped after the Second World War, but Truman had put the draft back in because of the Korean War, and it was still going. The draft required males who were age 19 to 26 to serve at least 2 years in the military. And you could enlist if you were willing to serve longer in any of the services, but if you were drafted, you would probably be drafted for 2 years and serve in the Army. I had just finished a master's degree, as Bob mentioned, from Columbia in 1955. And my draft board, which had given me an extra year after my undergraduate degree to go to Columbia, said, "Enlist or we will draft you." So I had already decided that I was going to enlist after my master's degree, and I was going to enlist in the Navy. And the way I was going to do that was to go to Naval OCS in Newport, Rhode Island. And I did. I took the physical while we were there at OCS, and we were there for about 18 weeks. And at the end of 18 weeks, those of us who finished were commissioned an officer in the Navy, an ensign, which is equivalent to the second lieutenant in the Army and Air Force. So while there, there was some suggestions that maybe some of you might want to go to flight training and fly for the Navy. And some friends and I talked about it, and we thought, well, maybe, but we have to take the physical, particularly eyes. You had to have 20/20 vision. And we passed the physical, and so we decided to go to flight training. Now, this was not a long-range plan. I never thought much about flying while I was in college, but it turned out that it was a wonderful experience. I felt good about serving our country, and I learned leadership and had a great time flying. The Cold War began in 1947 and continued until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. We had a kind of, we were at peace during that time, although there was some tension about the Soviet Union. And the reason was because we had come up with this idea and had a kind of agreement from the Soviets that, and it was called mutual assured destruction. And what that meant was if one of the nations dropped an atomic bomb on the other, a nuclear bomb, I should say, the response would be so overwhelming that both nations would end up annihilated. And actually, that served very well because neither nation dropped a nuclear weapon on the other during that whole period of time. So I was on active duty from 1955 to 1959, and I have a question for you. If the Soviets had dropped a nuclear bomb on the United States or any of our allies, how would we have responded? You may say we would probably unleash hundreds of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, onto the Soviet Union and devastate Moscow and all other cities. But you would be wrong, because we did not have ICBMs operational until, remember this date, October 31, 1959. That was the Atlas that became operational in several silos in the U.S., and we were ready to fire off ICBMs with nuclear warheads after October of 1959. So, to retaliate, if the Soviets bombed us, we would have to fly bombs to the Soviet Union, just as we did when we bombed Japan in 1945. I completed Navy OCS, as I said, in about 18 weeks and was commissioned, and I went immediately to flight training at Pensacola, Florida. That was primary flight training, which actually we didn't get started as quickly as I thought we ought to, but we were in ground school, and by the time we got to flying and soloed and began working to complete primary flight training, it took about 9 months. So we learned how to fly. We learned about the Navy and the Air Force and how planes were used. We learned about weather and the way the Navy used aircraft carriers. We learned to solo and to land and to do acrobatics, all kinds. We learned to fly on instruments. We learned to fly at night. We learned how to get out of spins that the plane might get into, and in order to learn how to get out of them, we put planes in a spin and then recovered from it. And the last month that we were in primary flight, we made for a month we made landings on a landing strip in Foley, Alabama, that had a carrier deck painted on it. So we made good landings on this. We would make a landing. We would climb out to 200 feet or so, fly into a big racetrack pattern with a bunch of other airplanes that were going through the same process. And we would learn how to land on a carrier deck, but it wasn't moving. So then we went out to sea in the Gulf of Mexico, and made 6 landings on a ship that was steaming in the Gulf. And that was the completion then of our primary flight. And about that time, we were given a form that asked, what kind of plane would you like to fly in advanced training and later in a squadron? Would you like to fly big bombers, transports? Actually, some people chose transports because when they got out of the Navy, and they were planning to get out after 3 or 4 years, they could easily then move into commercial flying. But I don't remember whether or not helicopters was a choice. But a choice that we were attracted to was jet fighters. So there were three choices. You could put first, second, and third, and we all put down jet fighters, jet fighters, jet fighters. And the Navy said to me, thanks, but you're going to fly Sky Raiders. AD-6s, A for attack, D for Douglas that made the airplane, and the 6 modification. This plane was later designated, when they changed all the designations of Navy aircraft, it was designated the A-1. I don't remember if the Navy said, you're going to love this airplane, but I did. I think maybe we might put some of those planes up there now.
You want to go past the squadron?
Yeah. We have several images of the AD-6, but I was sent to Corpus Christi, Texas, to learn how to fly this airplane. It was a single-seat, piston-driven engine plane with a big 4-bladed propeller. It was produced in the Second World War, but never flew in the war. But it did fly quite a bit in the Korean War. And then later, in the late 60s and very early 70s, it was very actively used in Vietnam because they could pull a carrier up 10 miles off the shore, and in 2 or 3 minutes, the pilots who were flying these planes would be overland and could help the ground troops that were fighting in Vietnam. The plane had, the engine had 18 cylinders, and it was a Wright 3350, Wright spelling with W-R-I-G-H-T. It was the same engine that was in the B-29, but the B-29 had 4 of them. It weighed about 12,000 pounds. It could pick up its own weight in armament and fuel. It was carrier-based and could fly from very long distances. And if external tanks were attached under the wings, it could fly even further. Unlike jets, it could fly at very low levels and did not have the problem that jet engines have, which is that they burn tremendous amounts of fuel at low levels. And that's why when you fly commercially and take off, the plane tries to get to 30 or 33,000 feet as soon as possible to save fuel. It could carry bombs and rockets and 20 millimeter cannon. There were 2 cannon in each wing, and so you could use the plane for strafing. And it could it could provide close air support to Marines or Army on the ground. So in advanced flight training, 5 students, each with a plane, and an instructor with his plane, flew together. So there were 6 of us, and we flew every day, and we did everything that the instructor could think of. We did lots of acrobatics and chasing each other through clouds, and until we were really comfortable in flying the plane. And we practiced dropping bombs by going from an altitude of, say, 5,000 or 6,000 feet and diving toward a rake target. These targets were monitored and could then give you a report at the end of the day. We fired rockets on those targets, and we dropped bombs from practice bombs from diving, and strafed. I have something here I want to show you. This is a practice bomb, and there's a little hole here that they put a cartridge in that when it hit made a little smoke indication, so that the people monitoring the targets could tell where you had hit the thing. I'll pass that around. So besides diving to send the bombs or the rockets, we also learned how to launch the bombs using a half Cuban 8 maneuver. The half Cuban 8 was half of an 8 and was probably that terminology was probably it was probably used during the times when we had air shows after the war. So what is a half Cuban 8? If the plane is flying at full power, 200 feet off the ground, just before the plane gets to the target that you want to hit, the pilot pulls the plane up into a loop, and at 60 degrees of pitch, the bomb is released and goes out in a kind of a loopy way. The plane, you pull 3 Gs. A G is the equivalent of a gravity. So you pull 3 Gs as you're coming through this. The bomb is released. You keep on going up to the top of the loop, and you are on your back. You roll out and head back the other way. That's half of the 8. If you wanted to do the whole 8, you would do it all again. At the top of the loop, the sky radar would be at about 1,900 feet. So we practiced how to do that with these practice bombs. So after about 5 months of flying and some additional ground school, including learning to receive Morse code, which I found a lot of trouble. But we were given our wings, and we were sent to active squadrons. I went to VA 42 at Oceana, Virginia, which is just inland from Virginia Beach. And maybe we could put that squadron picture on right now. These are the officers. There were 22 officers, 20 flying officers, and the man on the left, far left, was an air intelligence officer, and the man on the far right was a maintenance officer who supervised 120 enlisted men who kept the planes flying. And we had 14 planes. We spent some time on shore at Oceana, Virginia, and some time on a carrier. When on a carrier, we took the entire squadron aboard. The carrier would leave, probably in our case, most of the time, it would from Newport News. It would fly out into the Atlantic, and we would fly 14 aircraft to that carrier and land them on the carrier, and they would store them. And in the meantime, the troops, the 120 enlisted men and others and equipment would have been taken to Newport and loaded directly onto the carrier. And we would be part of an air group that had about 4 squadrons, each flying different airplanes, and maybe 2 air groups. When we arrived, we learned that the squadron had 2 missions. The primary mission was low-level nuclear delivery. The secondary mission was close air support, which I've talked about, and which was actually used quite a bit in Vietnam. In 1957, of course, there was no situation which needed close air support, but we continued to train, but our focus was on nuclear delivery. Our task was to be ready if the Soviets dropped a nuclear bomb, to be part of the retaliation. Each of us was given 2 targets, came through the air intelligence officer, and we worked with the air intelligence officer to plan a route for these targets. The likelihood of my targets and the way I was to be launched toward them was off a carrier in the North Atlantic. And the idea was to fly across Norway and Sweden and into either, one of the targets was in the GDR, the East Germany, and the other was in Russia. So we were planning to fly the nuclear weapon at 200 feet over the land and at 50 feet over the water to try to escape the radar. Now, the B-59s were going to deliver nuclear weapons as well, and they were going to fly at altitude and do their best to avoid the anti-aircraft and the missiles that would be coming from the land. So we flew every day, and we got better at flying in a division of 4 aircraft in close formation, and we learned how to follow pre-planned routes on the land, and in that case we would do it with just 2 planes, one leading and another chasing. But we learned to use landmarks, bridges, rivers, towers, communities, cities, to follow a route. One year in January and February, for about 6 weeks, we took the squadron and all the equipment to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, mainly because the weather there was so perfect during that time. We were able to split the squadron into 2, and from 6 to noon, one half flew, and the other half flew from noon to 5 or so. And we were really doing armament practice. So we dropped bombs. We used diving to drop the bombs. We also used the half Cuban 8 to drop the bombs, and we did rockets and strafing, and we got a lot better at hitting the targets. But because we were split into 2 groups, my tenants also improved quite a bit. Officers also had other duties in the squadron, and each squadron was required to have a legal officer. But in order to be the legal officer, you had to have gone to Naval Justice School, which was a 6 weeks program. And no one in our squadron had been to that program, so I volunteered and talked with the skipper about this. And by the way, the commanding officer of a squadron is not called captain or, buddy or whatever. He's called skipper. So the skipper said, yeah, if you want to go to Naval Justice School, you go and you'll be our legal officer. So I was there. And actually, during the time that I was legal officer, we held, John Maul will be interested in this, we held 3 courts-martial. And it was my hope that before we went into the courts-martial, as legal officer, I was not I was not either defending or prosecuting the person accused. I was to watch and advise the skipper so that he could sign off on this courts-martial and send it forward to JAG, which is where John Maul was, Judge Advocate General, to review this. And so every courts-martial was reviewed and I guess appealed. But what I was going to say is that it was my hope that we could get the accused to plead guilty before we went into the courts-martial, because it made things a lot easier. So when we're on the carrier, we also flew every day when weather permitted it. And we learned how to fly with the carrier and the operations, because there were different kinds of planes. There were planes taking off all the time and landing. Flight operations was incredible confusion and noisy. If any of you ever get a chance to visit a carrier and watch flight operations, it's the thing to do. So we learned that we could either be launched from the catapult or we could make a deck launch. Now, that's a little different than the jet aircraft, because the jet engine doesn't generate enough flying speed for the jet to be able to simply be positioned on the carrier deck, go up to full power, hold the brakes, and then release it and fly off. Because by the time they got to the bow, they still would not have been at flying speed. On the other hand, the reciprocating engine was able to generate flying speed a little bit quicker, and so the Sky Raider could either be launched on a deck launch or be catapulted off. If you were catapulted off, you were at flying speed when you hit the bow, and the trick was to simply rotate the aircraft slightly nose up, and you would fly right on off, pick up the wheels and the wings, and go find the leader who had designated a spot at an altitude to rendezvous, and the four planes would get together, and we would fly someplace. We're out at sea. There's no landmarks, so we would probably turn on a heading and fly that heading for, say, 20 minutes, then turn exactly to the left, maybe, and fly another 20 minutes or so. We were just flying together, getting used to doing that, and after about an hour and 20 minutes or so, we would come back to the carrier. That is, we would come back and look for where we thought the carrier was going to be. And since all during this period, there was technology that helped you find things, automatic direction finding, as now all planes have, and it's very easy to keep track of where you are. But you couldn't use that because at wartime, the enemy could use it too. So there was no technology. So if we didn't find the carrier, we would set up what was called a square search, and we would actually make the area that we were searching over larger, and we would finally find the carrier, and then we would land on the carrier. Landing on the carrier was a routine which you followed each time. First of all, you would fly directly over the carrier, and the leader would brake left into a turn until the leader was just flying the opposite direction of the carrier, and then he would come around and make a landing in the carrier. But after the leader broke left, the second plane would wait a few seconds, and then he would brake left, get behind him, and then you would have all four planes in the racetrack pattern, and we would come in and land. Usually, the flight operations could recover aircraft every 14 seconds. So you were pretty close to the plane flying next to you. By the way, I should mention that the carrier always, for takeoff and landings, in other words, for flight operations, was always steaming into the wind. And you needed to have 28 knots of wind over the deck. So if there were 10 knots of wind, the carrier might be going 20 knots or so that you had at least 28 knots of wind, because that helped slow down the aircrafts when they are coming in to land. Sometimes we were flying with a task force, which meant there might have been 2 carriers and lots of destroyer escorts and destroyers, and maybe even some cruisers. And so it was a lot easier when you left the area and flew for an hour or so to find the task force and get back. The one issue you had to be careful about was to make sure that you landed on your own carrier. Very embarrassing if you didn't. In 1958, we made a 3-month cruise to the North Atlantic, and we visited Lisbon, Oslo, and Rotterdam. And we were able to go to shore at each of these cities. My roommate and I asked for a few days of leave, and we left the ship in Oslo and then came down through a part of Holland and rejoined the ship at Rotterdam. And we also had an opportunity during this cruise to work with the British carriers and learned how flight operations were conducted on their ships. So returning to Oceania, we continued training, especially the low-level work. A colleague and I flew 2 missions on a long, low-level flight, which were sort of at the end of our training to demonstrate that we could really do the job. We took off from Oceania and flew north, one plane chasing the other. So a leader was, and then the second would chase, flying 200 feet over the land, 50 feet over the water. And we had a route that we flew on. It was always interesting. If one of your checkpoints was flying just to the left of this bridge over this creek or river, which was to the left, if you looked left as you went over and the bridge wasn't there, by the time you looked right, you're beyond, and you couldn't be for sure where you were. So we made some adjustments. We flew up to Massachusetts, turned due east, and flew out to an island that had monitored targets. And for this flight, we carried a shape attached underneath the plane, and it was about 8 or 9 feet long. We've got some shapes that I think are probably the same shapes that we used in some of these pictures. Maybe we can see. This looks pretty much like the shape that we used, and this was mimicking a nuclear weapon. It was obviously not armed at all. It had a little smoke device in it that would make us smoke when we launched it. But we would use the half-Cuban 8 to launch this on a target on this island. So we made the launch. We were headed back towards shore. We would get back into the Massachusetts area and again fly on north to Vermont and New Hampshire and that area, turn and go back down through the mountains and the areas, again trying to pretend that we were avoiding the radar. That was a 9-hour flight. And I made 2 of those. My Navy commitment was for 4 years, which was up in June of 1959, but the Navy indicated that I could leave duty, active duty, about 3 months early. So I had kept in contact with a person that I had met at Columbia, who was working on a Student Personnel Administration master's degree, and by then she was Dean of Women at American University. And she called me and said, when are you getting out of the Navy? And I said, probably in March. And she said, well, we have just fired the director of housing at American University. And the Dean of Students says that when I told him about you getting out of the Navy and having a master's degree in Student Personnel Administration, that we would hire you if you wanted this job. And so I took the job. It turns out that a little Navy area just to the west, to the east of Washington is a landing strip called Navy Anacostia, and they flew Sky Raiders. So actually, I went to join American University on the 1st of April, which was sort of an interesting time to join, you know. But I was able to contact Naval Anacostia and join that reserve squadron and fly 1 weekend a month at that reserve squadron. So I joined the administration at American, and 2 days later, I had an appointment with a very feisty graduate student who was managing a freshman girls' residence hall and finishing a master's degree. Her name happened to be Sandra Damewood, and in about 10 months, we were married. And then we continued working at American for another year or so, and then we left and went to Boston, and she taught school, and I worked on a doctorate there. Later in 1959, I learned from my former colleagues at VA 42 that the primary mission of the squadron was being changed to close air support. And secondarily, it became a training unit to retrain officers who had been at desk jobs in the Pentagon or elsewhere and needed flying time to be able to return to a flying squadron. I learned that a former colleague of mine had retrained John McCain, who later was shot down over Hanoi in October 1967. But by that time, he had transitioned to another airplane, so we can't really say that he was in a Sky Raider. But the point was that the mission to deliver nuclear bombs had been changed after we had done all of that training, and we're getting really good at doing this. I had no idea why at that time, and I doubt no one in the squadron knew, but the mission was changed by directives from higher up. But now it's obvious. ICBMs and later submarines, very shortly after the Atlas was put in operation, submarines also had missiles, and they replaced the B-29s and the Sky Raiders to accomplish deterrence. I'm going to stop there and see if any of you have questions or you'd like me to talk about anything else. Yes?
The assumption is low-level delivery of a nuclear weapon you don't return from.
Well, actually, that's a good question, because I didn't tell you that there was a lot of information about the blast and about the size of the bomb that we were going to be delivering from the Sky Raiders. Obviously, it wasn't, nearly as big as it might have been dropped from a B-29. But the data that I saw suggested that if the pilot made everything correctly, you were flying at the right speed, which was probably in the AD only about 250 miles an hour, or knots an hour, and you pulled up exactly into 3 Gs, and the bomb released at 60 degrees of pitch, and you made a good rollout on the top, and you were getting away from it, you had a 97% chance of avoiding the blast. But the idea was that the targets that I had, I thought I could get back to perhaps Sweden, but not to the carrier. The carrier would have been off in the North Atlantic. And so we thought probably that I would have to make a crash landing someplace, perhaps in a lake or something, But frankly, we didn't worry too much about that. But if we escaped the blast, we were going to continue flying as long as it'll fly. Yes?
Could you describe what it was like to land on a carrier the first time and following the meatball, what that was all about?
Yes. Well, let me talk about the landing the first time when we were practicing these 6 landings. We made these 6 landings to complete our primary flight. I made the landing. I caught a wire, which is actually a cable that helps you stop very quickly, but it's not jerky. But you're thrown back against the seat when you catch the wire, which is actually one of the best feelings you've ever had. So let's talk about landing on a carrier. It's not nearly as difficult as people think it is. But I said the carrier's moving, and it's moving pretty fast, and you're getting 28 knots at least of air across the deck. And at the stern of the ship, there is a big, now this has been improved, but basically it's still the same. There's when I was flying, there was a convex mirror that was about this wide and about that tall, and it had green lights around the edges. And when the plane, if this is the plane, the carrier is going in this direction, and you brake left and you come down and you're going this way, when you get to the 45-degree angle, because you're making a 90-degree turn to come back into the carrier, when you get to the 45, there is a light that is positioned further back toward the stern in front of the mirror, and it shines this light into the mirror. And when you see it, and the cone of light goes out behind the carrier. When you see the light, it looks like a meatball about this big around, a yellow meatball. And if you are at the exact speed and altitude as you are making the approach, the meatball is right in the middle of the mirror. If the meatball is high, you're high. And power is generated in these controlled in these single engine aircrafts by a handle on the left. So you squeeze that handle just a little bit to take off power, and the meatball starts coming down into the middle. And then you try to get it right in the middle. and you keep flying right in until you get to, and there's a landing signal officer standing next to the mirror who is on the radio with you. And if you come around at the 45 and you don't see the meatball, you say, "I don't have the meatball." And the landing signal officer says, "Of course you don't. You're low." Or "You're high." You know, the landing signal officers did this all day long, and they were not happy with people who couldn't fly the meatball. So if you've got the meatball in the middle and you're flying, what you're doing is you're in a descending way to the deck of the carrier, and just before you are ready to land, the landing signal officer turns all the lights to red. So you take your eyes away from the mirror and look at making the landing. And the idea is to try to catch the third wire. If you catch the first wire, it means you were very close to the stern at the rear of the ship, and you could have easily hit the rear. So you don't want to catch the third wire. If you catch the fourth wire, it means you were a little bit further down and a little high, and that's not as good, and you get marked down for that. If you don't catch a wire at all, you go on a round, which is called a bolter. And they say, I remember being asked about, does everybody make a bolter? And they said, probably everybody bolts at least once or twice. So it's not unusual to miss all the wires and go all the way around. But you'll see from a picture of the carrier that we have, this is a tail hook down, and it's about to catch it looks like there are 5 wires on this deck. So it looks like we're about to catch the third or fourth wire here. And the mirror is over, the plane is in front of the mirror now, and you can't see it, but it's just behind it. So let's go to the carrier picture. You can notice that, first of all, Navy aircraft, the wings fold, which was always interesting, because when we would land at Air Force installations, we would come off the taxiways and fold our wings, and they all thought that was really pretty nice. It's just so that you can store more aircraft. But you can see there, the carrier has a canted deck. The Second World War, I don't think we had any canted decks. Those were all redesigned after the war. And the reason is that you can land and take off on this canted deck and still store all these aircraft up here. And where the plane that we just saw in the picture was, the plane was on that white line between those two series of lines of white squares. So, is that it? That answer it? Okay. Yeah. Yes.
When you make the approach to land, like in seconds and minutes, how, like when you got to the end of the ship and make your final cable connection, how long is that? Seconds, minutes?
Well, the landing speed of the AD was 92 knots, and let's say the carrier is going at 30 knots, so you're moving at about 60 knots an hour. So it's not very fast. You have some time.
I was just wondering.
Yeah.
How much time you have?
Well, the other thing is, people say, what about when the carrier is going up and down in rough seas. Well, occasionally, destroyer escorts disappear, and then they come back. And then they disappear. I mean, smaller ships really are affected by the rough seas. The carrier, not so much. And anyway, the advice when we were learning was, don't worry about the sea, just land. And if it's coming up, then, you'll catch the wire sooner.
I've heard the concept of, if I pronounce it right, spatial distortion. Did you ever have people who would, in one of the backwards turns, lose that spatial recognition?
Yeah. Well, it's possible to... What's the terminology with the ears when you lose the space? What?
Equilibrium. Vertigo.
Vertigo. Yeah. You can get vertigo in, doing these things. And particularly, jet pilots who are flying in incredible turns and loops and things, oftentimes, they wear G-suits. And the G-suit is plugged into the plane, and it gives pressure on the legs and the outer parts of the muscles of the body, trying to keep blood into the brain, because the vertigo means the blood is moving out of your brain, and that's what pulling. Jet aircraft could pull perhaps in these turns or these loops maybe 7 or 8 Gs, and when they do that, what happens is their vision comes. They lose the side vision, and they know that the vertigo is the problem. And so they try to get out of that as soon as possible. And then it comes right back.
So you're the only person in this plane, just one? Or do
Yes.
you have a helper? You have helpers?
No, this is single seat. There's no room in there. There's not even room for your lunch.
Do you have a parachute? Do you have a parachute on?
Yes.
Do you have to practice parachute?
Navy flyers never jump out of airplanes. But yes, we flew with parachutes. And some of my friends have had problems, and they've parachuted out. But it's not something that they look forward to. So we didn't practice it. What we practiced was, early on, the AD didn't have a seat that was fired when you want to get out of it. But when we were flying, it was you hit a button and you were going to be thrown right through the canopy, and you were outside, and then you could say, "I think I better pull the ripcord."
So do you continue to fly, and when you get on a commercial airplane, do you tell the pilots, "I have experience"?
I did not fly any after I flew 2 years at Anacostia, Navy Anacostia in Washington. So I never flew after that. I was on to something else, I've oftentimes, recently, I say recently, I don't know, in the last 4 or 5 years, we landed, and we had a great landing, and we were leaving the plane, and there were 2 pilots standing there, one a woman and a man, and I said to the man, "Nice landing," and he said, "She made it." Oh. Yeah, so... Yeah.
Would you tell the story of your first landing on the flight deck?
The first landing? Well, this was the practice in the Gulf, and I landed, caught a wire, and I was looking out the left side of the canopy, and I was just, delighted that we were there, and I'd done it. And I turned to the right, and there was some guy in a colored uniform with his head covered, and his mouth was going like this, and he was, yelling and screaming, "Watch me, watch me." And the first thing he wanted me to do was to let up on the brakes, so I would roll back a little bit, because the wind would cause the plane to go back a little bit, and then we could pick the hook up. Otherwise, you can't get the hook picked up, because the hook is in the wire. And then, as soon as I rolled back and picked up the hook, he gave me this to get off, because we got landing aircraft behind you. So what I remembered after that was, when you land, look out the right side of the sky. Yes.
Since you were a single one person in there, so when you were dropping the make-believe bombs and so forth, you had to navigate doing all of that, pulling that, plus doing the flying and everything. Go back to the cockpit there.
I'm not sure that you can see the stick, but the stick is right in the middle, and that's what controls, it controls the wings and the ailerons and the rudder. There are also two pedals that control, if you push forward, they control the brakes. If you slide them, they help with the attitude as you're making a turn, because it changes the ailerons, and you learned how to work with it's like the people playing the organ, you got to use your feet as well as the stick. But on the stick, there was a pickle for bombs. There was a pickle for rockets, and there was a trigger for strafing. So it was all with one hand, and the power, you're using the left mechanism for the power.
It's hard to see, but you can see the red button on the top of the
Yeah,
stick
it looks like, I'm not sure this is a cockpit of the Sky Raider, but it's
I didn't go.
It's whatever.
It's a cockpit, though. I think you have one.
I was just curious, so this is a small world, because I spent 2 years at Naval Air Station Kingsville, which was part of the same command as Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. It was Naval Air Advanced Training.
Yes.
One thing I learned there was that pilots in training were a very self-confident group, and maybe a little cocky at times. But surely sometime, whether it was landing on a carrier or doing acrobatics, or you must have had a time when you were a little bit worried about your mortality. Did you have any incident that you remember that you weren't sure you were going to come out of?
I think it was in the back of our minds, but we really weren't. I don't remember being afraid at any particular time, or really worried about it. One thing that I was trying to think of came to my mind, but now I've lost it. I think there was an expectation. We were on a trip with the kids. In fact, we were coming back from China, I think, and we stopped in Hawaii for a couple of days, and it so happened that Top Gun was being shown. I mean, it was just out at that time, and we went to Top Gun, and when we came out of the theater, my son, who was, I think, about 14 then or so, said, "Dad, was it really like that?" And I tried to make the pause just long enough And then I said, yes. So some of those people that you may have come run into in Kingsville went into anti-submarine work. And that was a Sky Raider, but it was a different modification. And they dropped...
Most of them were flying A6s or A10s.
Okay, yeah.
Newer model of the jet.
Yeah.
That was used in Vietnam.
Yeah.
But there were a few that occasionally missed the carrier. You didn't want to be the officer of the day when something was...
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, you guys have been terrific. Thank you so much.